I don't know how many of you remember a show back in the 80s called The A-Team. It had four rather colorful characters in it. And it was, of course, about a fictitious members of a United States Army Special Forces unit. They were being court-martialed for a crime they didn't commit. They escaped from military prison. And while on the run, they worked as soldiers of fortune, private investigators, fix-it guys. It was created by Stephen J. Cannell and Frank Lupo. They did a feature film a little bit later on after they stopped the normal series. But anyway, the A-Team is, and I didn't know this, it's nicknamed that for the U.S. Special Forces Operation Detachments Alpha from during the Vietnam War. Hannibal, who was, well, Colonel John Smith was nicknamed Hannibal. He was the leader of the team, played by George Papard. And he got the nickname Hannibal from the original Hannibal, who took his men over the Alps on elephants. And this Hannibal, this John Smith, took his men over the wall to escape court-martial. But what's interesting about the A-Team is that, you know, each episode they were there to help people. And they would get their mission. They would make a plan. There would be obstacles, and that would create tension in the audience, wondering, will they be able to fulfill their mission? And then, of course, success at the end of each episode. And Colonel Hannibal Smith would say, "I love it when a plan comes together." Well, God had, as I've been demonstrating the last two lessons, had a mission. His mission is different than our mission as the church. His mission is to reclaim us as his children. And just to remind you, I set up the fact that God created a paradise for us. We rebelled in that, even though it was Adam and Eve, the disobedience of one resulted in the disobedience of everyone, actually. Then there was the promise that God would fix that. Then came, of course, obstacles, our sin, our rebellion, our evil, our not wanting to play nice. And then there was a partial fulfillment in the nation of Israel. And I showed how Israel's exodus from Egypt was sort of the model by which God, is showing his mission. And now I want to talk about the completed mission in Jesus Christ. And I'm going to use Galatians chapter 6, Galatians chapter 4, verses 1 through 7 as my text. Now I say, as long as the heir is a child, he does not differ at all from a slave, although he is owner of everything. But he is under guardians and managers until the date set by the Father. So we also, while we were children, were held in bondage under the elemental things of the world. But when the fullness of time came, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, so that he might redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. Because you are sons, God has sent forth the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. Therefore you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then an heir through God. I really believe that Paul in this text tells us the mission is complete. And he starts off by saying, in the fullness of time, God sent forth his Son. That means when the time is right, but I can't help but hearing Hannibal Smith's voice. I love it when a plan comes together. But God is really saying, I love it. I love now that my plan has come together and is ready to be fulfilled. And so God has set everything up. He's worked through history. He's worked in Israel, but not just Israel. He's worked the whole world over, because everything that happens in the world, no matter whether God recorded it in Scripture for us or not, has an effect upon what happens in Israel. It just does. And there are, there are things about history that I think we will be amazed to find out once this is all over. And I really hope that God has a question and answer room that we can go to and find out some of these things that happened. And I'm gonna be first in line, I can guarantee you, because I got a lot of questions. But nonetheless, I really believe that God was working this whole time. And now Paul says the mission is complete. And he's writing this to the Galatians who were trying to come to God through a way that wasn't quite right. But let me tell you what Paul says to show that the mission is complete. The mission completed begins with a birth. It says, born of a woman. And I really think that Paul is going back to Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, where God said to the serpent, I will put enmity between your seed and the woman's seed. And her seed will crush your head, and your seed will crush his heel. But there, the idea of the seed of the woman, I think that there's a little bit of hint there of what we call the virgin birth. Now, the virgin birth is not misnamed. It rather should be the virgin conception, because there was nothing unique about the birth. There was nothing supernatural about the birth. But there was something very supernatural about Mary's ability to conceive without the help of a man. It didn't come about in the normal way in which children are conceived in this world. And so that's the real miracle, is the conception in Mary without a man. And, that, of course, we've got all kinds of theology that we could develop from that. But I just want to focus upon the fact that, this particular time of the year, people focus on the birth of Jesus, but that's where everything began with the mission complete, was he was born of a woman. And again, I think that there's a hint in God's speaking to the serpent in Genesis 3:15, where he talks about the seed of a woman, that here Paul is showing the fulfillment of that there's a hint of the virgin conception. But of course, God God did that in Genesis, actually a number of times, hinted at the fact that he was going to overcome the brokenness of our world and the brokenness of childbearing in order to bring the right child in at the right time to do the right thing. Abram and Sarah were childless, and they first tried to get one of his hired men to be, the son of one of his hired men to be an heir, and then they tried to get an heir through Hagar, Sarah's handmaiden. And although to us that might seem like a rather odd things to do, and maybe we might even think wrongly about them, but that was the way they did things back then. And so I don't know whether they're, as some say, trying to help God, or just, God's told us this is going to happen, so do we have to figure this out? And of course, God told Abraham and Sarah that they would have a son when he's 99 and she's 89. And even though they do live lived longer back in those days, they both knew that just wasn't going to happen, but it did. And so this is the first hint that God can help with conception. Even though they still conceived the normal way, they still did. It was still a supernatural conception in a way, because they just needed help. And of course, Isaac and Rebekah needed some help. And it just sort of, and then we get into the New Testament in Luke chapter 1. Here's Zacharias and Elizabeth. They need help, but they conceive. And then it comes to Mary. I don't want to get into to the controversy over Isaiah 7:14, where in older translations, Isaiah says, well, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son. But some of the more modern ones say, well, a young woman, and there's a big debate about that. I kind of got to thinking that it's sort of interesting that God's help with conception was to older women, Sarah, and it looks to me like Rebecca is a little bit older as well, and then Hannah, and then Elizabeth. And of course, I don't know how old Hannah was. I don't think that there's really much of a hint at her age, but she does appear to be a little bit along in age. But then definitely Elizabeth, and then there's, of course, Samson's parents. So it kind of seems to me that that Isaiah 7:14, there's another aspect that we haven't explored here that Isaiah is kind of hinting at, and I believe that Isaiah 7:14 is more of one of what we call a shadow prophecy, or he wasn't directly predicting the virgin birth in a sense, because if you read his context, you'll find that Isaiah has in mind at least some young woman in his day. So, how that all works out, I don't know, but I think there's a little bit of a focus here upon she's a young woman, whereas God helped Sarah, who was older, and then Elizabeth, who was older. But now all of a sudden, here's a young woman who's at the other end. Before it's women who, have passed the childbearing age, and yet here's a woman who's of childbearing age, but she's young, but she hasn't gone into that area we call marriage, where she can have children just yet. So I think that's kind of interesting, but still, what's more interesting about the whole thing is the fact that God, one of the Godhead, the Son, came into our world and was actually born as a child. Think about the vulnerability of that child. When in Matthew's account, Herod wants to kill this heir to the throne of the Jews, and yet God, of course, protected the child along the way, and so God shows his own vulnerability and shows the fact that he didn't send in some superhuman robot to do all of this. He sent in a normal, he sent in a human being. And so the mission completed began with a birth, born of a woman. Mission completed came through, Paul says he came forth to redeem those who are under the law. Through redemption. I'm going to kind of bypass the idea of the law right now, but focus upon the idea of redemption. Now, going back to Exodus, the Exodus from Egypt by Israel, Israel became sort of the model. They were held in bondage, they were slaves, and God redeemed them out of Egypt and brought them to a land of his own choosing. And yet, we're not talking here about physical slavery, but rather bondage to sin. We are slaves to sin, slaves to Satan. And we've been held in that. And God is going to redeem us by paying the price to buy us back. And of course, in the first century, there was a thing which in English we call manumission. In Rome, you could save up your money as a slave. And I guess slaves were on occasion paid, not always, but some slaves could become trusted, just as Joseph became trusted in Potiphar's house and then trusted in the jail or in prison. So some slaves could be trusted and thus paid, and they would save up their money. Now, in some places, you could go to a temple and give your money to God, and then that God would be redeeming you. Or you could get your owner to give permission to have you redeemed as well. But usually, as a slave, you earn your own price. And so what's interesting here is that God pays the price for you through his Son. And so Jesus then takes our place in owning the deed that got us out of God's favor, our sin. He owned the consequences, death, but he also gave us the victory through resurrection. But he's taking our place in all of this, not just in the consequences, but also in the victory. Because his resurrection, as Paul would say in 1 Corinthians 15, becomes the first fruits of everybody else's. So his resurrection is just the first of many to come. And so that's how the mission is completed, is by redeeming us, buying us out of our slavery. And what's also interesting too, and maybe I'll cover this later on down the road, what I read about this was just because you were freed as a slave, and sometimes even became a Roman citizen as a result, didn't mean that you were totally free. You couldn't join the military, and there were certain levels in society that you could not marry into as a result. So yeah, you were freed, but it was kind of limited. But here, God frees us to be his. And in a way, ours is kind of limited as well. I remember years ago, I was at a lectureship with a good preacher friend of mine. He and I were staying together at some friend's house. And after the lectureships, we used to always gather with other friends at somebody's house and discuss the lectures of the day. And one fellow had given a lecture on freedom. And of course, his idea of freedom was that we're set free to where we don't have to do anything. That's kind of a simplistic way of putting it, but that's kind of the way it came across, that we don't have to be these things. But my preacher friend and I were arguing, no, true freedom is setting us free to do what we're made to do. You wouldn't put wings on a bus. Other things would have to take place in order for that bus to fly. And you wouldn't put a big plane on a railroad track because it doesn't have the equipment to fit on the track and to run it. And so, if we could kind of give personality to, an airplane, if an airplane said, hey, I want to go, I like that train, those train tracks, I'm going to go do that. Well, you can't. You may think that you're free to go, but your real freedom is flying. So you see, true freedom is being set free to do what you were created to do. But anyway, mission completed through redemption. Now, mission completed also gives us a relationship. Paul said, God has sent forth his Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. Now, here a while back, I was reading where, Abba focuses upon intimacy. It's what small children call their dad. And so it's the equivalent of daddy in our language and in English. And so, I've heard about guys who get up and in prayer and they bow their heads and say, hey, daddy. But since then, a lot of scholars and others have said, no, Abba does not mean daddy. But it does recognize the sense of intimacy. However, there's another aspect of it. And there's a fellow that I was reading who had this really driven home in a modern setting. He went over to Israel to visit, and he was in Tel Aviv, and he got stopped by customs and was grilled for several hours, and afterwards he had to run to the bathroom really bad. And so he'd get there, and there's a Jewish father dealing with his not a preteen, but a little bit younger than preteen son, and trying to explain things to the son. And the father said to his son, when I ask you to do something, I want you to call me Abba. And he said, upon hearing this, I was surprised by three things: that he was speaking in English and Hebrew in the same breath, that he was using an everyday experience for child training, and that most people think Abba means daddy, but not quite right. Daddy doesn't have the bite of Abba. It's personal, but it's personal, which is part of the meaning, but it's not the whole story. Abba doesn't mean daddy. It doesn't mean dad. It means Father, I will obey you. So Abba brings the sense of intimacy and obedience together. And in fact, there's only three places in all the New Testament where it's used. First, of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane in Mark chapter 14. And it's there when he says, Abba, Father. And it's in the sense of him being intimate in prayer with his Father and asking him to stop this heading towards the cross. But then he stops and says, nevertheless, not my will, but your will. So you see, there's this sense of, I can ask the Father this thing, but also it doesn't matter what I want. What matters is what the Father wants. I will obey him. And then Paul uses it in Romans 8, in the sense of living by the flesh versus living by the Spirit, which is the spirit of obedience in many ways. And so when God sends the Spirit into our hearts to cry Abba, it's because we are following the pathway that God wants us to. And the same here in Galatians chapter 4. So we're given a relationship in which there's a sense of intimacy, but a sense of obedience. But it's the idea, though, of being a child of God. We have that connection to God, but we also pledge to be obedient to him. And I know that's what my own dad wanted out of me. He wanted to know that when he instructed me, when he said, this is what I want, that's what I would do. And so we have then mission completed that gives us a relationship. And then we have mission completed that gives us an inheritance. We are now heirs. I like what Paul says. He says, therefore you are no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then an heir through God. Now, back in the first century, basically the only heirs were sons, were firstborn sons. And they, in the Jewish family, the firstborn got double what everybody else did. But not having a son made it necessary to adopt. You see, that's what Abraham wanted to do when God said, I'm going to make you a great nation, and through your seed, I'm going to bless all the families of the earth. Abraham said, I don't have a biological son. So here, let me adopt this fellow who was born in my household. And God, of course, God said no, but you see, that's what God's doing for us. And that's what people did back in the first century. They did not adopt children because they loved them and wanted to create a family like we do today, which is good. And of course, I'm not putting that down at all. Just back in the first century, they adopted for the purpose of being an heir. One of the most famous ones that you may or may not know about was Julius Caesar. He was desperately in need of a son, and all he had was a daughter. And she was married several times. And last to Caesar's longtime rival and current friend, Pompey, Julia only had one child, but that child died at birth, and so did Julia. And so that ended his father's hopes for an heir from his direct blood, which if Julia had a son, he probably could have done as well. So Caesar sought his closest male relative to adopt his own, who was Gaius Octavius. And Caesar took him under his wing, and in the final years of his life, took him to Spain to fight there. And then when he died in 44 BC, when he was assassinated, that's when he officially adopted. And that's when Gaius Octavius found out about it. And of course, he became the first emperor once he gained power away from Cassius and Brutus, who were still in power after killing Julius. But that's one of the most famous ones. And so that's what being an heir is all about. And for us, we are sons. It doesn't matter whether you're male or female. You're a son of God in that sense. You're an heir. And it doesn't matter your ethnicity. It doesn't matter whether you're Jew or Greek. It doesn't matter whether you're Roman. It doesn't matter, whether the Romans consider you to be worthy or not. And today, it doesn't matter whether you're black or white. It doesn't matter whether, you're Hispanic or Asian. What matters is that we all can be adopted as God's sons and become heirs. And it doesn't matter your social status or economic status. What matters is that God has adopted you. So when we look at this, God created a plan. Because once he created God had a plan. Because he created paradise. We rejected his paradise, and God decided to gain us back. And he did that through Jesus. So the mission of God was to restore humanity to our original place as his image bearers. He filled this mission in the only one who successfully lived his entire life as an image bearer of God. And that's Jesus, who then became the Christ, the Messiah. He became the fulfillment of all the shadows in the Old Testament leading up to this. But all of this began with a birth. The birth of a child to an ordinary couple who were poor. And we know that because of their offering in Luke chapter 2. But God used this, if you will, human weakness to complete his mission and to crush the head of the serpent. So God's mission completely reverses our situation. If you're not in Christ, I hope today you'll seek him. And if you as a brother or sister are part of the family of God, you need some help in your walk, please let somebody know so that they can pray with you and encourage you and support you. But you see, God had a mission, and his mission was fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And that mission is to gain us back. And he did it all on his own. He used us, but we certainly didn't give him the help that he would normally want. And so I pray that you will remember and you will live by the mission of God every day. God bless.